Long ago, human beings lived together on a single world before finally developing the technology to travel amongst the stars. Early space travel, although widespread, was largely unregulated, slow, and uncertain, accomplished through a hodgepodge of methods that required humanity to constantly pursue increasing levels of technology. One of these technologies, known as thinking machines, or AI, greatly assisted humanity's expansion, as it not only allowed for human beings to more effectively travel throughout the cosmos, but it also improved our abilities to live within each of the new worlds that we discovered. Unfortunately, AI improved our lives in so many ways that we eventually became dependent upon it, and the owners of these AIs used this dependence to enslave us. In an effort to free ourselves from the shackles of AI, humanity launched a massive and violent rebellion that lasted for almost a century, known as the Butlerian Jihad. Though this struggle claimed billions of lives and completely shattered thousands of worlds, humanity ultimately managed to not only defeat the machines, but also remove every single computer-based technology from existence, wiping out everything, all the way down to even the simplest of calculators. In order to adapt to this new computer-free existence, an organization known as the Spacing Guild emerged with the ability to travel through folded space without the assistance of AI. To accomplish this, their pilots consumed massive quantities of a substance known as the spice melange, which not only opened up their minds, but actually allowed them to peer into the future so that they could navigate through the chaos of folded space. Unfortunately, this spice melange could not be farmed, could not be manufactured, and could not be mass-produced through any technology known to man. Instead, it could only be harvested from a single location, a planet known as Arrakis, or, as the locals refer to it, in the very first chapter of the very first book in Frank Herbert's Dune, the Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohiam places a poison-tipped needle next to Paul Atreides' throat and tells him, "If you withdraw your hand from the box, you die. This is the only rule. Keep your hand in the box, withdraw it, and die." "What's in the box?" Paul asked. "Pain." The Reverend Mother explains to Paul that the purpose of this test is to determine whether Paul should be considered a human, worthy of life, or merely an animal that cannot control its own impulses and needs to be put down. After passing the test, Paul asks, "Why do you test for humans?" "To set you free." Free? Once, men turned their thinking over to machines in the hopes that this would set them free, but that only permitted other men with machines to enslave them. To which Paul replied with a recitation of the most important law in the entire Dune universe: "Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind." In Dune, Frank Herbert imagined a future in which human beings increasingly relied upon advancing technology for 10,000 years, until our reliance made it all too easy for a handful of people to use AI for the purpose of enslavement. And while the books don't describe the ensuing conflict in any significant detail, we do know that the Butlerian Jihad resulted in at least two major changes to humanity's civilization. First, the Butlerian Jihad was so incredibly destructive that almost every single record of human history was lost. Second, any form of computer technology was destroyed and banned forever. That means no more AIs, no more computers, no robots, no androids, nothing even approaching a thinking machine could ever be designed, built, or owned by anyone, anywhere within the known universe. And the punishment for violating this rule? Trial and immediate death. Okay. But in the Dune universe, by the time humanity created this rule, human civilization had already expanded to over 10,000 different worlds throughout multiple galaxies. And as Frank Herbert so succinctly explains, law always chooses sides on the basis of enforcement power. Morality and legal niceties have little to do with it when the real question is, who has the clout? In other words, if you can't enforce the law, then the law is meaningless, just words on paper. And with something as incredibly useful as computers and AI, how could any legal system possibly hope to enforce a complete ban on all AI development across thousands of worlds when we already know how phenomenally valuable these technologies are to us today? To accomplish this level of enforcement, humanity would need to restructure its entire society so that every single source of power throughout the universe depended upon constant policing and enforcement of this all-important law, so that any violation could be swiftly identified and punished. And put simply, in the Dune universe, that's exactly what humanity did. In the years that followed the Butlerian Jihad, an order of incredibly powerful women emerged, known as the Bene Gesserit, who helped to establish the religious teachings of the Orange Catholic Bible, which contained the supreme commandment prohibiting the disfigurement of the soul, as well as a prohibition on the creation of any machine designed in the likeness of a human mind. After participating in the formation of this religious work for all of the universe to follow, the Bene Gesserit then inserted themselves onto almost every single planet in the Empire, both to spread their religious teachings, which contained their supreme commandment, as well as to make sure that no one ever dared try and violate the most important of rules. But the Bene Gesserit didn't limit themselves to functioning merely as religious leaders. They also served as valuable guides to the most powerful members of society, especially through their leaders, the Reverend Mothers, who has developed the ability to unlock knowledge of every one of their female ancestors by pulling from the information contained within their own genetic memory. So, by obtaining this incredible level of both religious and political status almost everywhere throughout the universe, the Bene Gesserit could now monitor and manipulate just about everyone, so that nobody could ever hope to violate the most important law without their knowledge. In addition to the Bene Gesserit's religious and political manipulation, the prohibition of engineering thinking machines could also be enforced through the government in the form of swift and brutal force. Because shortly after humanity wiped out the machines, civilization reorganized itself into a feudalistic empire ruled by the Emperor of House Carino, as well as by numerous great and lower houses, collectively known as the Landstrad. In theory, the great houses of the Landstrad possessed approximately the same amount of power as the Emperor, or at least the same amount of advanced atomic weapons, to keep the Emperor in check by way of mutually assured destruction. However, the Emperor also possessed the Sardaukar, an army of soldiers from Seleucia Secundus, who, as a result of being trained and raised in an incredibly harsh planetary environment, had become an almost invincible fighting force. As a result, no member of any great house would ever dare to try and expand their own power through the development of AI, for fear that a much more powerful emperor would see this as a challenge to his authority and obliterate them. However, at the same time, no emperor would ever try to create thinking machines for himself out of fear that doing so could provoke every single house into banding together and launching an apocalyptic nuclear war that would destroy the entire empire. But perhaps an even greater protection against the development of thinking machines came from the Spacing Guild, who secretly consumed massive amounts of spice so that they could peer just far enough into the future to navigate their massive ships through folded space. Even the Emperor himself knew to avoid challenging the Spacing Guild, as he would be relatively powerless without his ability to move his Sardaukar armies around throughout the universe. However, even though the Spacing Guild monopolized all of space travel through their secret ability to peer into the future and navigate folded space, they also understood that as soon as someone figured out how the Guild accomplished their tasks, a competitor could try to replace the Guild, either by securing their own massive quantities of spice or by attempting to replace the Guild navigators with AI computers. Thus, if the Spacing Guild ever learned that one of the great houses had begun researching these forbidden technologies, then the Guild could just cut off all forms of trade with every planet controlled by that house until an army of the Emperor's Sardaukar, or maybe a planet-cracking nuke, descended down upon them in the middle of the night. And finally, if any organization in the universe existed with more power than the Spacing Guild, it would probably be the economic monopoly that controlled every single material good within the Empire. The Combine, Honnet, Ober, Advancer, Mercantiles, or CHOAM, operated as a publicly traded super conglomerate owned and controlled by the Great Houses, the Spacing Guild, and the Emperor. This organization was so absurdly powerful that the shift of one duodecimal point in interest payments could change the ownership of an entire planet. However, by its design, only the Emperor possessed the power to hand out or revoke directorships within this organization, which meant that the Emperor could ensure that the greed of the great house leaders would always keep their attention focused on gaining more of the Emperor's favor and more of their own wealth than on ever uniting together to overthrow a terrible Emperor. And of course, there existed the spice melange itself, which was created through the life cycle of the makers, or the sandworms, and acted as the glue holding all of these systems together. Without melange to ignite the linear prescience of guild navigators, people cross the parsecs of space only at a snail's crawl. Without melange, the Bene Gesserit cannot endow truth-sayers or reverend mothers. Without the geriatric properties of melange, people live and die according to the ancient measure, no more than 100 years or so. In Frank Herbert's Dune, monopolies controlled the universe. One monopoly controlled religion, another controlled travel, and another controlled the economy, all held together by a single resource that everyone, from the poorest of servants to the most powerful emperors, could not live without. And thus, human civilization maintained stability for over 10,000 more years. And no one in any position of power would ever dare violate the most important law in the universe, because nobody in power ever wanted to do anything that could disrupt the same religious, political, and economic systems that had made them so powerful. And so long as nobody ever came along and completely destroyed every single one of these foundational monopolies all at the same time, then these monopolies would be able to guarantee enforcement of the most important law in the universe forever. Throughout his six-book series, Frank Herbert explored several complex themes, ranging from politics to economics to religion to even existential threats to humanity, such as environmental disasters and artificial intelligence. Yet, the most obvious and prominent theme in all of the Dune series would probably have to be, don't trust your leaders.
I worked to create a leader in this book who would be really an attractive, charismatic person for all the good reasons, not for any bad reasons. Then power comes to him. He makes decisions. Some of his decisions made for millions of people, millions upon millions of people, don't work out too well.
If you only read the very first book of the series, then you could be forgiven for assuming that Paul followed a traditional hero's journey. After all, when we're introduced to Paul, he is still an adolescent teenage boy who lives in the shadow of a powerful father and is reluctant to do what must be done to fulfill his destiny. But if he can just find the strength that resides within him, then maybe, just maybe, he will overcome his fears, stand up to evil, and become the hero who will save us all. However, Paul is not a traditional hero, anti-hero, or even a villain. Instead, Paul's journey much more closely resembles a Greek tragedy, in which the main character tragically finds himself faced with impossible situations whose choices, even if they appear reasonable at the time, will only result in further tragedy. And make no mistake, in many ways, Paul's motivations are completely understandable, if not noble. Time and again throughout Dune, we see Paul being forced into impossible situations that he did absolutely nothing to deserve, And in most of those situations, Paul honestly does try to find the correct and moral way out of them. For example, Paul didn't ask to be born a duke's son, forced to constantly look over his shoulder for assassination attempts, or to be born a genetic anomaly haunted by visions of possible futures. But throughout Dune, Paul trains himself to survive throughout this impossible situation and even embraces that which makes him special. Paul also didn't ask to be tortured by a reverend mother so that she could satisfy herself that he remained a human and not an animal. But after completing the test, Paul still seeks to further his understanding as to why his mother would subject him to this testing. Or when forced to fight a duel against the Fremen warrior Jamis, we see that Paul does everything that he can to try and find a way out of killing him up until the point at which he realizes that he does not seem to have any other choice. And Paul certainly didn't ask to lose his friends, his family, or his entire people through a genocide that the Harkonnens inflicted upon all of House Atreides. And throughout the novel, Paul is constantly trying to find the best path to defeat his enemies without allowing anything to spiral out of control. Paul isn't bloodthirsty or power hungry. He's just a kid, constantly put into impossible positions through no fault of his own and constantly trying to find the best path out. However, while fleeing for his life with his mother, Paul finds himself with the ability to see into the future with two main branchings along the way ahead. One which forces Paul to confront his Harkonnen grandfather in a manner that we don't know very much about, other than that it sickened him. But as for the second option, Paul sees a path which held long patches of gray obscurity, except for peaks of violence. He had seen a warrior religion there, a fire spreading across the universe with the Atreides green and black banner waving at the head of fanatic legions drunk on spice liquor. In the end, Paul chose to take the path that led to joining the Fremen. Yes, they'll call me Muad'Dib, the one who points the way. Yes, that's what they'll call me. And he closed his eyes thinking, now, my father, I can mourn you. And he felt the tears coursing down his cheeks. While we never know everything that Paul saw from each of these two possible paths, we do know that Paul didn't choose to become Muad'Dib out of a desire for power. He chose that path, at least in part, because it would allow him to avenge the murder of his father, as well as to defeat the nightmarish Harkonnen family responsible for not only the genocide of his own people, but also the brutal and systematic oppression of the Fremen. So, given what he could see into the future, can you really blame Paul for making this choice? By deciding to take shelter with the Fremen, Paul realized that he could harness their power, free them from the shackles of the Harkonnens, and seize control of the most powerful and valuable resource in the entire universe, which would not only allow him to strike back at the Emperor himself, but would even make it possible for the Fremen to have the financial resources to transform Dune into a paradise world. Paul could serve as the Fremen's savior, and Paul's enemies would be punished for all of the horrors that they inflicted upon him. And the more time that Paul spends with the Fremen, the more that he falls in love with their culture and even starts to adopt it as his own. Unfortunately for Paul, his abilities to look into the future were far from perfect. For example, Paul realized that his actions could spiral into an uncontrollable jihad in which the Fremen cleansed entire worlds and killed billions of people, all in the name of Muad'Dib, but Paul never actually realized that his choices would cascade towards a point of no return. In fact, in the books, it is made clear that Paul honestly believed that he could find a way out of the jihad while still finding a way to use the Fremen to defeat his enemies. On several occasions throughout Paul's multi-year campaign against the Harkonnens, Paul intentionally considers different paths in the hopes that one of those paths will prevent the jihad from happening. Paul realized that he had plunged once more into the abyss. Blind time. There was no past occupying the future in his mind, except he could still sense the green and black Atreides banner waving somewhere ahead, still see the jihad's bloody swords and fanatic legions. It will not be, he told himself. I cannot let it be. Or consider even later in the novel. The imperfect vision plagued him. The more he resisted his terrible purpose and fought against the coming of the jihad, the greater the turmoil that wove through his prescience. His entire future was becoming like a river hurtling towards a chasm, the violent nexus beyond which all was fog and clouds. But despite his best efforts to avoid the most terrifying of futures, Paul continued to make choices throughout several years of guerrilla warfare and systematic disruption of the spice trade until the emperor himself arrived, alongside with the other great houses, and unleashed the Sardaukar down onto Dune in an effort to end Muad'Dib's rebellion once and for all. In the books, the arrival of the emperor results in the Sardaukar attack on Siege Tabor, in which the Sardaukar kidnap Paul's sister, Alia, and even kill a child that Paul had with Chani. My son is dead, Paul said, and he knew as he spoke that it was true. My son is dead, and Alia is a captive, hostage. He felt emptied, a shell without emotions. Everything he touched brought death and grief, and it was like a disease that could spread across the universe. And Paul thought, how little the universe knows about the nature of real cruelty. And with that, Paul launched his assault on the emperor himself. He fired nuclear missiles at the shield walls that offered the emperor protection, crippled his shuttles so there would be no escape. He threatened to start a chain reaction that would destroy the spice to prevent the Spacing Guild from letting any of the other great houses come down onto Dune. He seized control of the emperor's throne and promptly unleashed a second jihad upon the universe. And Paul saw how futile were any efforts of his to change any smallest bit of this. He had thought to oppose the jihad within himself, but the jihad would be. His legions would rage out from Arrakis even without him. They needed only the legend he already had become. He had shown them the way, given them mastery even over the guild, which must have the spice to exist. In other words, by discovering the Spacing Guild's secret, that the guild could not survive without the spice, and teaching this secret to the Fremen, Paul had ensured that the Fremen could now force the Spacing Guild to transport them anywhere throughout the universe to bring their jihad down onto anyone who opposed them, instantly, all in the name of Paul Muad'Dib.
My lord, the great houses have answered. They refuse to honor your ascendancy.
We await your orders, Izan al-Ghaib.
Lead them to paradise.
As a result, the emperor and all of his allies throughout the great houses, who had amassed unprecedented power and wealth through Chom over several millennia, could now be completely destroyed and replaced by Emperor Paul Atreides in just 12 years. Muad'Dib's Kizat missionaries carried their religious war across space in a jihad whose major impetus endured only 12 standard years, but in that time, religious colonialism brought all but a fraction of the human universe under one rule. He did this because capture of Arrakis, that planet known more often as Dune, gave him a monopoly over the ultimate coin of the realm, the geriatric spice melange, the poison that gave life. Here was another ingredient of ideal history, a material whose psychic chemistry unraveled time. Without melange, the Sisterhood's Reverend Mothers could not perform their feats of observation and human control. Without melange, the Guild Steermen could not navigate across space. Without melange, billions upon billions of imperial citizens would die of addictive withdrawal. Without melange, Paul Muad'Dib could not prophesy. And if we ended Paul's story right here, it might seem as if the jihad responsible for killing 60 billion people across thousands of worlds represented the worst consequences of Paul's miscalculations and poor decision-making. But in the third novel, Children of Dune, Paul's second son, Leto II, realizes that by encouraging the Fremen to terraform Dune, Paul had set the planet's ecology onto a path in which the environment would change so quickly that the sandworms would soon be driven into extinction. Worse still, these sandworms, the makers of spice melange, could not survive on any other planetary environment in the universe, so any efforts to move them somewhere else would be completely in vain. We're in a dark passage. Without spice, the Empire falls apart. The Guild will not move, planets will slowly lose their clear memories of each other, they'll turn inward upon themselves. Space will become a boundary when the Guild navigators lose their mastery. We'll cling to our dune tops and be ignorant of that which is above us and below us. Thus, Paul's actions didn't just remove House Harkonnen and an evil emperor from power. He provided the Fremen with a means to transform Dune into a paradise, and in doing so, inadvertently secured the sandworm's extinction. Soon, the Spacing Guild, which held human civilization together for thousands of years, would fall. The Bene Gesserit, who also relied upon the spice for their very existence, will lose all of their influence throughout the universe. The economic incentives of Chom would cease to exist for all of the great houses, and the entire empire would collapse. Or to put it another way, Paul had just torn down everything necessary to enforce the most important law in the universe. Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind. So now it would only be a matter of time before human beings return to engineering thinking machines, with the most likely house to kickstart this process being the technologically advanced people who lived on the fringes of the empire known as the Ixians. The Ixians contemplated making a weapon, a type of hunter-seeker, self-propelled death with a machine mind. It was to be designed as a self-improving thing which would seek out life and reduce that life to its organic matter. In fact, these thinking machines would be so terrifying that they would possess the ability to see into the future, much like Paul Atreides, so that they could more effectively exterminate us. No matter what we do or where we try to hide, these self-improving thinking machines will find us and destroy us. The seeking machines would be there, the smell of blood and entrails, the cowering humans in their burrows, aware only that they could not escape, while all the time the mechanical movement approached, nearer and nearer and nearer, louder, louder. Everywhere she searched, it would be the same. No escape anywhere. So, despite all of humanity's best efforts to abide by the most important law in the universe for thousands of years, the decisions made by Paul Atreides had torn apart everything necessary for that law's enforcement, and now nothing could stop the gathering storm. But perhaps most tragically, by the time that Paul finally realized what he had done, it was already too late. No action to slow Dune's terraformation would prevent the inevitable extinction of the sandworms. No warnings that Paul gave could prevent the machines from returning. And quite literally no solution that he could come up with as he desperately peered into the future would lead to anything other than the end of humanity. Through his own personal quest for vengeance, Paul Atreides not only ruined himself, he had ruined the future of humanity. No matter what we do, no matter what choices we make, thanks to Paul Atreides, every single path would now lead to our extinction. Every single path, that is, except for one.